Good afternoon and welcome to the final two sections of Chapter 16, Section 6 and 7, Absolutism and Constitutionalism in Western Europe. This is where we'll summarize and put everything together. We'll be using the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text, 7th edition. We start out with constitutionalism, and during this whole chapter we've been talking about differentiating between the absolutism in France and Spain, most successfully and notably in Spain, and in France, and constitutionalism, which is what we will move toward in England, excuse me, and also in the Netherlands. While France, Prussia, which we'll get to in chapter 17, Russia and Austria evolve into absolutist states, England and Holland evolve toward constitutional states. And constitutionalism implies a limited government, and this sets the foundation and the basis for the government that we have in the United States today. We'll see evidence of a bicameral legislature, which gets absolved into a unicameral legislature at some point, and limiting the powers of the monarch. Two kinds of constitutions. A majority of the constitutions then were unwritten constitutions. There were bills of rights that were written. The petition of right will be mentioned. Other documents that limit power, but not necessarily a true constitution. A constitutional republic, a weak union of loose states, like the Netherlands will give us an example of, and then constitutional monarchy, which is just as absolutist. Power is most closely associated with France, constitutional monarchy most closely associated with England. During this period of time, since 1215 and the signing of the Magna Carta, there had been continuous efforts within England, first and foremost, above all other countries, to create a parliamentary procedure to limit the power of the king. And at this point that we're meeting up here, the Parliament has the right for new taxes, passage of laws that are proposed by the monarch, and advise the monarchs on policy. Keep in mind, though, the monarch still had some pretty impressive power over the Parliament, not most of which was the idea that he called and dismissed Parliament at his pleasing. We'll find some of the monarchs coming up in this lecture dissolved Parliament, only called it once every 2 or 3 years. Monarchs also named most officials and judges, conducted foreign policy without any parliamentary approval, except that of approval of new taxes, and after 1534 headed the Church of England, which was the second most powerful entity in the realm. We get this transition towards full-fledged constitutional monarchy with the transition from the Tudor dynasty to the Stuarts. And most scholars would agree that the Tudors were very forceful, very powerful, but maintained good relations with Parliament, whether that being sly like a fox under Henry VIII, and establishing the Church of England for some of his own personal matters, or whether it be strong like a lion like Elizabeth, who managed to keep a balance between exercising power and giving in to Parliament. Well, this is all set up because Elizabeth is a female monarch. She refuses to marry. She marries herself to the crown and to England, and knows that if she does marry, she will succumb to her husband, and he will take over. This means that she dies without an heir. So the crown is passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who's crowned James I, and his most crowning achievement is the King James Bible. He's a very bright person, but not necessarily of the mold of most Englishmen, and we should know by now that the English and the Scots had a rather tumultuous relationship most of the time. He wanted to go back to pure absolute monarchy, and this did not fit well with the Parliament. It felt like a slap in the face when he mentioned that divine right was of a necessity. Religious issues within England that also plagued James. James and his predecessors of the Stuarts are somewhat sympathetic, or at least believed to be sympathetic, to the Catholic Church and Catholic rituals. Well, the Puritans have a pretty strong hold and a pretty big voice in England at this time. And as is their name, they wanted to purify the Church of Catholic rituals. And the House of Commons sympathized with the Puritans, making for a head-on clash, not only over divine right versus parliamentary procedure, but also over church issues. Charles I inherits the throne in 1621. He's seen as a Catholic sympathizer, and he is constantly in need of money that's being blocked by Parliament. His unpopularity grows when he appoints William Laud, Archbishop of Canterbury. And Laud moves toward imposing Anglicanism, or the Church of England, on Scotland, where Presbyterians had a stronghold, and on the Puritans and other dissenters. And he uses some very brutal means, and this does not win favor with the people and with Parliament. Charles needs money. He gets Parliament to give him the revenue that he needs, and in exchange, in 1628, he signs the Petition of Right. After this, he disbands Parliament, ignores the Petition of Right, and goes 11 years without Parliament, furthermore establishing his idea that absolutism is a necessity in England. Because of all of the upheaval brought on by Laud in Scotland and also in Ireland, Charles is terrified by Scottish invasion, by Irish rebellion, and needs Parliament back to give revenue. This constant seesaw battle here from the powers that be. And when Parliament reestablishes itself, it is referred to as the Long Parliament because it does not close outright for 20 years. During that time, they ultimately seek to lead revolution against the king and to limit the monarch's power. They require the signing of the Triennial Act, requiring the king to call Parliament at least once every few years. They still refuse to give Charles an army to put down the Irish and the Scottish threats. And this infuriates Charles to the point that he brings a group known as the Cavaliers, sympathizers to the crown, royalists, and they raise an army and unsuccessfully try and attack Parliament. Civil War begins, and as a result of this English Civil War, that goes on for approximately 7 years, Charles is the first monarch, English monarch, that's executed by his own people. And this is really significant because it signifies the end of any hope at absolute monarchy and the divine right doctrine. Not that others won't try. The Civil War is essentially won or put down by a man named Oliver Cromwell. In 1645, he creates a new model army, and he defeats and captures Charles. He is a sympathizer to the Puritans. He abolishes, Parliament abolishes monarchy, and England is now a commonwealth, with Cromwell chosen to lead, the first ever non-monarch to lead England. He supports religious toleration for all except for Catholics. And at this time, England is still bitterly divided. The Puritans, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, everybody is very hurt and distrustful of everybody else. And this allows for constant bickering and upheaval within Parliament. And finally, Cromwell basically becomes a military dictator and controls England under that guise until his death in 1658. He dissolves Parliament, and the shadow of his rule is very, very imposing and strict. He closes theaters, bans newspapers, dancing, dueling, swearing. He tries once again, as his absolutist predecessors did to bring Scotland and Ireland under some more strict English control. And this effect on the people spurs them to beg to get monarchy back, ironically. They have been so repressed that the army recalls Parliament. In 1660, they invite Charles' son, who was living in exile in France, to return as King Charles II. And this return to monarchy is known as the Restoration. Charles agrees to respect the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right, but he is kind of a closeted Catholic, or Catholic sympathizer at least, as is believed or perceived, more importantly, not necessarily believed, by the public and by Parliament. He continues to press and urge for religious tolerance, but Parliament forces several acts, including the Exclusion Act and the Test Act, that continues the issue of religious persecution. People couldn't join the military, couldn't get certain jobs, or restricted unless they were a part of the Anglican Church. That leads us to the Glorious Revolution. King James II is the final of the Stuart kings, and he inherits the throne from Charles II. He once again, as the Stuarts do, like banging your head against a wall, keeps pushing for absolute power, and claims the right to suspend the law, places Catholics in high posts in government and in the army. But to make a long story short, Parliament gains power. James is forced to flee, and Parliament invites his daughter, Mary, who was a Protestant, and her husband, William, and invites them to rule jointly. And in 1689, they agree to the English Bill of Rights. And a lot of these things should sound very familiar to you based on our own government. King couldn't raise taxes or maintain an army without the consent of Parliament. King couldn't suspend laws, protected individual rights, right to trial by jury. It outlawed cruel and unusual punishment. And a lot of these things are the responsibility of the man on the bottom of this slide, John Locke, and his treatises on civil government. And this is where we get the idea of life, liberty, and property. We'll be talking about him more candidly in chapter 18, but these are some of the foundations, some of the connections that need to be made between our own country and the evolution of European government. One very brief slide at the end, not related to England, but related to the other constitutionalist country, more of a constitutionalist republic, as I mentioned, are the United Provinces of Netherlands. And if we recall from chapter 15, there's a lot of upheaval. Netherlands is essentially split. The northern 7 provinces are what we're talking about now, the United Provinces of Netherlands. The southern 10 have already split off, and they are forming Belgium. And the Netherlands has got a really great thing going. During this period of time, between 16 and 1700, it's considered the golden age of the Netherlands. Vast achievements in science and art and literature. It was a republic. A couple of the key terms here, the stadholder was the representative to the States General, and that was the general council of all the provinces getting together. They succeeded in large part because of their religious toleration. They welcomed all religions, including the Jewish, and this really sparked a strong middle class and fostered great economic growth. A lot of this economic growth centered around the fishing industry and the merchant marine, and that, coupled with the banking and trade that were already strong parts of the economy, really provided the Netherlands with a strong foundation. Unlike Spain, who has their golden age and then really falls into severe trouble, the Netherlands is able to maintain a more consistent, although lower key role within Europe after the so-called end of their golden age. The Dutch East India Company is a force to be reckoned with. They cut into Spanish trade and commerce,